The morning of March 13, 1942 began like any other in Abingdon, Virginia. Inside a small, quiet café nestled in the heart of town, the scent of coffee filled the air. Locals moved about in their usual rhythm. Waitresses took orders, dishes clattered in the kitchen, and the hum of conversation drifted between tables. In a corner booth, two men dressed in military uniforms sat casually, placing their breakfast orders. To the outside observer, they were just soldiers passing through. No one could have imagined the violent storm that was about to erupt in that peaceful space. Moments later, two men entered the café. Special Agents Hubert J. Treacy Jr. and Charles L. Tignor of the FBI stepped in, scanning the room, their eyes fixed on the booth. They approached calmly, aware of the gravity of their task. These weren't just soldiers, these were fugitives. Charles J. Lovett and James Edward Testerman had deserted from the U.S. Army, assaulted a fellow serviceman, stolen firearms, kidnapped a taxi driver, and were now wanted men. Treacy and Tignor, acting on intelligence, were prepared to apprehend them. With composure and authority, the agents identified themselves, explaining they were searching for two deserters. Lovett and Testerman appeared still, non-reactive, until in an instant, the calm shattered. Without warning, Lovett drew a concealed .45 caliber revolver and fired at Agent Tignor, striking him in the arm and sending him crashing to the floor. In one fluid motion, Lovett turned his weapon on Agent Treacy and pulled the trigger. A bullet tore into Treacy's face. As he fell, Lovett continued firing, ensuring both agents were incapacitated. Tignor, struggling to draw his weapon with his uninjured hand, was struck again. Testerman, rising from the booth, aimed and fired at Treacy as he lay defenseless on the floor. The gunfire sent cafe patrons screaming, ducking for cover. Dishes smashed. The quiet morning had turned into a scene of chaos and bloodshed in a matter of seconds. Treacy, a highly educated and respected agent, would not survive. Tignor, gravely wounded, managed to stumble out the door before collapsing on the sidewalk. What had driven these young men, barely out of their teens, to turn their guns on federal agents? The answer would unfold over the coming days. But for now, one thing was certain: the manhunt had begun. If you love gripping true crime stories from real FBI files, hit that like button and subscribe for more. James Edward Testerman and Charles J. Lovett were not your average military men. At first glance, they blended into the ranks, young men clad in uniform, eyes forward, feet marching in line. But behind their regulation attire and forced salutes, both men carried troubled pasts and deep-rooted instability. Their paths to Fort Oglethorpe were not marked by honor or duty, but rather by defiance, mistrust of authority, and personal demons that no training could mask. Testerman, born and raised in Virginia, was known for his moody disposition and resistance to discipline. He had always bristled under the weight of rules, often clashing with superiors and shirking responsibility whenever possible. His enlistment came not from a sense of patriotism but as a last-ditch attempt to avoid the legal consequences of a minor criminal record. Within months he was already standing before a court-martial panel, charged with disobedience and dereliction of duty. Lovett, on the other hand, hailed from a small town in Tennessee, described by some as aloof and by others as outright hostile. He struggled to fit into civilian life before joining the army. He had a reputation for violent outbursts and a short temper. Like Testerman, his military record was peppered with infractions, drunkenness, fighting, and outright refusal to follow orders. He had served time in the guardhouse more than once and seemed to carry a grudge against every superior officer he encountered. The two men found common ground not in camaraderie or shared values, but in mutual disdain for authority and the structured life of military service. At Fort Oglethorpe, their paths crossed and their bond was quickly forged. United by a shared disillusionment and a growing appetite for rebellion, they began to talk in hushed tones about escape, about shedding the weight of military chains and making a run for freedom. What began as idle talk soon evolved into a chilling plan. Both men were angry, volatile, and convinced they had nothing to lose. Their growing resentment festered into something darker, more determined, and soon their whispers became blueprints for violence. Desertion was not enough. In their minds they had to make a statement, to take what they felt the world owed them, and to lash out at the institution that had tried to control them. The military hadn't broken them. Instead, it had built something far more dangerous. Two young men on the edge of rage, ready to erupt. Their plan to desert Fort Oglethorpe was not a spontaneous act of desperation. It was a meticulously crafted scheme rooted in resentment, fear, and a burning desire to escape the rigid confines of military discipline. James Edward Testerman and Charles J. Lovett knew that simply walking away wasn't an option. The army didn't take kindly to deserters, and consequences were guaranteed. So they planned something bold, violent, and irreversible. Under the cover of night, the two men gathered what few resources they had: information, weapons, timing. They waited for the perfect moment, and that moment arrived on March 9. Sergeant Clifton Hall had the misfortune of being on duty that night. A trusted non-commissioned officer, Hall was alone in the orderly room when the two men made their move. Approaching under the pretense of needing assistance, Lovett and Testerman quickly turned on the sergeant. One of them accounts would later differ, bludgeoned Hall with a blunt object, striking him repeatedly with ruthless precision. The attack was brutal and swift, leaving Hall unconscious and severely injured on the floor. Bloodied and motionless, he was no longer an obstacle in their path. With the path cleared, Lovett and Testerman rifled through the armory, stealing two high-powered service pistols, .845 caliber revolver, and a standard-issue Colt. They stuffed the weapons into their coats and exited the post with a chilling calm. The adrenaline was pumping, but the execution was cold and methodical. This was not an impulsive flight, it was the product of calculation and shared malice. As they slipped into the darkness beyond Fort Oglethorpe's perimeter, they vanished into the night, armed, dangerous, and driven by a sense of warped justification. Their first hours on the run were spent navigating back roads and avoiding patrols. Each step away from the fort fed their delusion of freedom, even as the reality of what they had done loomed large behind them. The assault on Hull, the stolen firearms, it was no longer just desertion. They were now fugitives from military justice, wanted men with blood on their hands and nothing to lose. The army would come after them, and soon the FBI would too. But for now, all that mattered was the escape. Their plan had worked, and the open road called, dark and full of promise. The fugitives' next move took a turn from desperation to outright criminality. Needing transportation and lacking funds, Lovett and Testerman set their sights on a taxicab. In Atlanta, Georgia, they hailed a driver under the guise of needing a long-distance fare. The unsuspecting cabbie agreed, unaware that the two passengers he had just picked up were armed deserters on the run. Somewhere along the route, as the vehicle moved away from the city's center and toward quieter, less traveled roads, the mood shifted. One of the men pulled a gun, leveling it at the driver's head, while the other rifled through the man's pockets. They ordered him to comply or be killed. With calm brutality, they stripped the driver of his wallet, taking every last bill. Then they pushed him out of the vehicle and left him stranded on the roadside. The cab now belonged to them, a rolling escape vessel, inconspicuous and fast. With one more witness behind them, they pressed forward, their eyes set on Tennessee. They drove with purpose, taking back routes and staying off the major highways to avoid detection. Along the way, they stopped briefly in a small town to make a peculiar purchase, a woman's handbag. The reason wasn't immediately clear, but it soon became obvious. The bag was used to conceal their stolen weapons. The logic was disturbingly simple. A man carrying a pistol drew suspicion. A handbag, slung over a shoulder or tossed in a car, looked harmless. With their firearms hidden inside, Lovett and Testerman moved more freely, more confidently. It was one more step in a string of calculated decisions that underscored their dangerous combination of recklessness and cunning. As they continued their flight, they ditched the taxi and secured other means of travel: bus rides, hitched rides, and stretches on foot. Eventually, they made their way into Virginia, choosing the small town of Abingdon as a place to lay low. It wasn't a random stop. Abingdon held a personal connection for Testerman. His girlfriend lived there. The town was quiet, out of the way, and seemed like the perfect place to disappear, at least for a while. They checked into a local establishment and tried to blend in, playing the part of wayward soldiers just passing through. But their past was catching up with them, and while they believed they were safe, the net was already tightening. As soon as word reached the FBI of the assault at Fort Oglethorpe and the identities of the deserters, a nationwide alert was issued. The military could pursue them as deserters, but the assault on Sergeant Hall and the armed robbery of the taxi driver escalated the matter to federal jurisdiction. The FBI moved swiftly, distributing wanted posters, alerting field offices, and tracking down every known associate of both men. Special Agent Hubert J. Treacy Jr., a seasoned and respected officer with a sharp mind and unshakable demeanor, was assigned to the case. Alongside him was Special Agent Charles L. Tignor, equally capable and committed to justice. The two men were stationed at the Knoxville field office and began gathering intel immediately. Within days, a critical tip came in. A relative of Testerman's girlfriend had reached out discreetly to authorities. The fugitive had contacted her, and he was believed to be in Abingdon. The information was enough for Treacy and Tignor to act. Without delay, they coordinated with local law enforcement and prepared for a quiet but decisive intervention. Their plan was simple: identify the suspects, confirm their presence, and make the arrest with minimal risk to bystanders. But as history would show, things rarely go according to plan. The agents arrived in Abingdon with urgency, but without flashing lights or fanfare. Discretion was key. They began canvassing the area, speaking subtly with locals and keeping their movements low profile. Eventually, they tracked the men to a small café where the fugitives were reportedly eating breakfast. Treacy and Tignor entered the establishment on the morning of March 13, 1942, prepared for a confrontation but likely not expecting the level of resistance they would face. In a few short minutes, the operation would descend into chaos. Gunfire would erupt, blood would be spilled, and Agent Treacy, who had dedicated his life to upholding the law, would not walk out alive. The FBI had acted swiftly, professionally, and with purpose, but against two armed men fueled by desperation and violence, no amount of preparation could guarantee safety. What followed would be a tragedy, and a reminder of just how quickly justice can turn into sacrifice. On the morning of March 13, 1942, the small café in Abingdon, Virginia was filled with the clinking of utensils, quiet conversation, and the smell of warm food. Special Agents Hubert J. Treacy Jr. and Charles L. Tignor stepped inside with practiced calm, their eyes scanning the room. They had received credible information that two military deserters, armed and dangerous, were in town, possibly at this very location. At a corner booth sat two men in military uniforms. Treacy and Tignor recognized them instantly as James Edward Testerman and Charles J. Lovett. Approaching the table without weapons drawn, the agents identified themselves. Treacy spoke first, his tone firm but even, informing the men that they were under investigation for desertion. Testerman and Lovett did not react at first. For a moment, the café remained in an eerie silence, patrons unaware of the tension simmering beneath the surface. Then, without warning, Lovett reached into his coat and pulled a concealed .45 caliber pistol. The gunshot cracked like thunder in the small space. The first bullet struck Agent Tignor in the arm, sending him spiraling to the floor in pain. The second shot hit Treacy directly in the face. He collapsed backward, lifeless, before he hit the ground. Testerman stood, drawing his weapon as well. As Agent Tignor struggled to recover, Lovett fired again, striking him a second time. The café erupted in screams. Patrons ducked under tables, dishes shattered, and chaos spread like wildfire. Tignor, bleeding and dazed, crawled toward the exit. With incredible resolve, he managed to stumble outside before collapsing on the pavement. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and panic. Agent Treacy lay motionless in a pool of blood. Lovett and Testerman exited through the back, disappearing into the alley as the town around them recoiled in horror. The fatal encounter had lasted only moments, but its impact was immediate and devastating. An FBI agent was dead, another critically wounded, and two dangerous fugitives were now on the run, having escalated their crimes from desertion to cold-blooded murder. Outside, the manhunt began instantly. Police and federal agents swarmed the area, setting up roadblocks and combing nearby streets. Lovett and Testerman, now fully aware of the manhunt, hijacked a passing car in an attempt to flee. As they sped down country roads, police units gave chase. The fugitives abandoned the vehicle and took off on foot through the backyards and alleys of the town. Gunfire was exchanged as officers closed in. Cornered, the men took refuge in the basement of a local home. Armed and unwilling to surrender, they barricaded themselves inside. Authorities surrounded the property, weapons drawn, calling for their surrender. The standoff stretched on for hours. Negotiations failed. It became clear that peaceful resolution would not come easily. Tear gas canisters were fired into the basement. Choking and disoriented, the two men finally emerged, their eyes stinging and hands raised. They were immediately taken into custody. Handcuffed and surrounded by law enforcement, the flight of Lovett and Testerman had come to a violent and dramatic end. The streets of Abingdon, still bearing the echo of gunfire, began to quiet. The community, still stunned, watched justice begin its course. The legal process that followed moved with precision and determination. Both men were charged with the murder of a federal agent, attempted murder, armed robbery, and desertion. The courtroom was packed during the proceedings. Citizens, military officials, and FBI agents watched as the full extent of the pair's crimes was laid bare. Testimony from eyewitnesses, including the wounded Agent Tignor, painted a chilling picture of two young men who had planned their crimes with deadly intent. Lovett and Testerman showed little remorse during the trial. Their defense was weak and often incoherent, relying on vague claims of mistreatment and disillusionment with military life. But the facts were clear. The jury deliberated briefly before returning a verdict, guilty on all counts. In 1942, both Lovett and Testerman were sentenced to life imprisonment. Given the severity of the charges and the murder of a federal agent, the court left open the possibility of further penalties pending military proceedings. There was no question of their guilt, only of how long the legal system would keep them behind bars. For many, justice had been served, but the sense of loss lingered. The FBI had lost a respected agent. A town had been shaken, and the families of the victims were left with wounds that no sentence could ever fully heal. After their sentencing, Lovett and Testerman were transferred to a federal penitentiary to begin serving their life terms. But the story did not end with the courtroom verdict. In 1946, just a few years after their convictions, both men were brought before military courts once again. The Army, which had its own interest in punishing desertion and the attack on Sergeant Hall, initiated further proceedings. This second trial added new layers of punishment. The military court confirmed their dishonorable discharges and imposed additional prison time, ensuring that neither man would be eligible for early release without significant legal hurdles. Still, due to peculiarities in sentencing structures at the time, some legal experts worried that the life terms might one day be subject to parole review. Lawmakers and law enforcement officials worked behind the scenes to block any chance of leniency. Neither Lovett nor Testerman ever returned to public life. Records show that they spent decades behind bars, mostly forgotten by the outside world. That the memory of their crimes, particularly the murder of Agent Treacy, remained etched in the minds of the FBI and the families of the fallen. Agent Hubert J. Treacy Jr. had lived a life of distinction. He held both a bachelor's and a master's degree in law, graduating from Loyola University in Columbia. He had served with honor and integrity, representing the very best of what law enforcement could offer. He died doing his duty, walking into danger without hesitation, and paying the ultimate price in the service of justice. His legacy lived on in the generations of agents who followed, inspired by his courage, intelligence, and sacrifice. The murder of Agent Treacy was not just a tragedy. It was a senseless act of violence, born from desperation and defiance. The events in Abingdon remind us how quickly order can collapse when people abandon reason and morality. Treacy and Tignor didn't walk into that café expecting a fight. They came to do their duty, relying on process and restraint. What they found instead were two men who had rejected every form of authority and chose brutality over redemption. The bravery shown by Treacy and by Tignor, who survived despite grave injuries, cannot be overstated. In facing the unexpected and overwhelming force of violence, they stood their ground. The FBI's rapid response, the coordinated effort by local law enforcement, and the eventual capture of the suspects showed the strength of community and justice in the face of chaos. We thank you for watching this account of one of the FBI's most tragic yet revealing cases. Stories like this highlight not only the dangers faced by law enforcement officers, but also the importance of remembering the lives behind the badges. What do you think drove these men to such violence? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping FBI case files from American history.